It was hot outside the National Archives, so I thought maybe I'd been just hallucinating. But then I heard it again, and we were inside and past the security guards, and it started to bother me. I couldn't quite place my finger on what it was that I was hearing. But I was standing in the long line outside of the rotunda that housed our nation's founding documents. I finally understood what it was that I was hearing. It was the sound of ignorance. And it was coming from the people all around me. I heard a grandmother tell her grandson that they were about to see that thing that they wrote on July the 4th, the Constitution or something. I listened to a high school student tell his friend on the phone that he was about to see the Constitution of Independence, man! And when the guard instructed us that the Constitution was next to the Declaration of Independence, so formed two straight lines, I heard multiple children asking their parents to tell them what the difference between the two documents was. True, perhaps some of those children hadn't had U.S. history in a wildly inefficient yet ever-growing public school system. And perhaps that brain was just really old. But still, it bothered me. It bothered me that a high school student, a senior by the looks of him, was not aware that the Constitution of Independence, well, it doesn't exist. I learned that day that there was a plague all across this nation, an intellectual plague. Well, people aren't getting dumber, per se. They are learning less and less, at least of the important issues. Now, the Constitution, true, is technically just a piece of paper, and true, fallible men were the framers of this document, and it's certainly not the only Constitution that's ever been written. But we know that the Constitution means much more than another piece of paper could ever mean. And true, it was written by fallible men. And they weren't extraordinary men either. James Madison had stage fright, George Washington's teeth started falling out at age 24, and Ben Franklin wanted to be a swim coach. They weren't demigods, and they weren't perfect. They were fallible men, but they were informed men. And that is key. Now, the reason I told you the story earlier, and the reason I over-dramatized today's lack of historical education, was to let you see, along with me, what the Founding Fathers would see if they were in line with me to see the founding documents. And that is an important aspect to be considered. What would these informed men think? It's probably clear what I think, and I assume that you all at least sympathize with me in my fight against ignorance, and perhaps even agree with me. But what would they think? Now, I realize I just asked a very broad question with many answers. I mean, Richard Stengel of Time magazine writes that people on the right and the left constantly ask about what the framers would say about some event that's happening today. What would the framers say, for instance, about whether the drones over Libya constitute a violation of Article 1, Section 8, which gives Congress the power to declare war? Well, since George Washington didn't even dream that man could fly, much less use a global positioning satellite to aim a missile, it's really hard to say what he would think. Once again, what would the framers say about whether a tax on people who refuse to buy health care is a violation of Congress's authority under the Commerce Clause? Well, James Madison didn't even know what health insurance was, and back then doctors used leeches. So once again, it's really hard to know what he would say. And what would Thomas Jefferson, a man who owned slaves, and in fact probably had children with at least one of them, think about a half-white, half-black, African-American president from Hawaii, a state that didn't even exist then? Again, it's hard to say. They weren't gods, and they weren't infallible. Yes, they gave us and the world a blueprint for the protection of democratic freedoms, the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom of press. But they also gave us the idea that a black person was 3/5 of a human being, that women were not allowed to vote, and that South Dakota should have the same number of senators as California, which is absurd. The truth is, they were just as diverse as our political figures of today. The only thing that binds them all together is the Constitution, and the only way they were able to create that document was through their education. Their knowledge of Locke and Hobbes, Rousseau, the Roman Republic, the Athenian democracy, that helped them many aspects of our government that are still present today. Their logical reasoning helped them to foresee problems that could come up in the future regarding freedoms and liberties. So first, I'll talk about how they would react to their governmental system's historical outcome. And then I'll cover their reactions to how the Constitution has influenced our country politically. And finally, I'll discuss about what they would think of our view of the Constitution. Well, they wouldn't be surprised, not all of them anyways, at the history of America. Benjamin Franklin, as informed as he was, said that the Constitution is likely to be well administered for a course of years and can only end in despotism, as other forms have done before it, when the government and the people shall have become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. In fact, when exiting the small state house in Philadelphia, he was asked what kind of government they'd created. His response was, "A republic, if you can keep it." Franklin would perhaps be shocked, or hopefully pleasantly surprised, that over 200 years later, the government still runs on the basic principles of checks and balances, popular sovereignty, and is not totally despotic anyways. The anti-federalists, however, the individuals that pushed for a written Bill of Rights, wouldn't be surprised. The only reason they pushed for one in the first place was to ensure that the government would not infringe upon the understood or the expected rights that other founding fathers just assumed would be protected. I mean, do we actually need a document that protects our speech, our religion, our press? I think that George Mason and other anti-federalists would simply look at the many pieces of legislation that have passed through Congress and the many Supreme Court cases and smile in a sad, "I told you so" sort of way. Thomas Jefferson, who feared that government intervention in the states and the economy would only lead to bigger government and less individual freedoms, would certainly not be shocked in looking at the political landscape today. And George Washington, the man who warned against political parties, would not be surprised to see the detrimental and negative effects that the system of the donkey and the elephant have caused today. So their first impression of our history would not be a shock or surprise or even astonishment. They knew the important concept that nothing new is under the sun. They would all react differently to certain amendments to the Constitution. Certainly, some would be outraged that the South had been stripped of its right to slavery in the late 1880s. Others would simply just wonder why it actually took 100 years for that to happen and for it to escalate into a war. Most would be surprised that women and 18-year-olds could vote, and that at one time alcohol was prohibited, and that abortion was legalized nationally and gay marriage was legalized in New York. But all in all, would they be surprised at the results over the years? Probably not to the core issues like liberties and government growth, perhaps to the more culture-based issues like gay marriage and abortion. But how would they react? These were men of action. They gathered at the small courthouse in Philadelphia to fix one government and ended up creating another one. These were the men that acted even earlier in the 1760s and 70s against the oppression of the British government. Surely we cannot think that if the founding fathers were here today, they would kick back, eat potato chips, and watch Fox News. No, these were men of action. Now, true, if they were here, they would actually have a lot to get used to. Seth Meyers, an accomplished comedy writer, put it interestingly when he commented that he, for one, thinks that if the founding fathers were here today, they'd be super freaked out about cars. I mean, you could talk to them all you want about the Second Amendment and gun rights, but they would just look at the road and scream, "What are all those metal beasts doing rolling down the thoroughfare?" Seriously, though, regardless of their probable awe or technological accomplishments, they would want to get politically involved. So what would they think about the system that they created? Jefferson would probably join the crowd of Bachman, Palin, and the Tea Party. And Adams and Hamilton would probably side with the most moderates or even left-wing politicians. Hamilton's National Bank would fit in nicely with Obama's socialized healthcare and quasi-ownership of General Motors, while Jefferson's staunch states' rights activism would match perfectly with the same activism of today and many conservatives. True, not all of them would fit in. John Jay would probably be severely disappointed disappointed in the judicial activism of the Supreme Court today. But the interesting point I would like to make is they would probably not make that much of a difference. While they probably are more educated than most politicians today, they are similar ideologically. And that means in the system that they've created, they would be able to make as much of a difference as Jim DeMint, Rand Paul, Chuck Schumer, or Joseph Lieberman would be able to make. And some of them would be pleased with this. Jefferson and Mason would surely be happy with less government control and more checks and balances, and would be happy with the grassroots movement because it epitomizes their idea of government by the people. John Adams and Alexander Hamilton would probably be slightly frustrated, for their concepts of big government and paternalism would lead them to want to have more control and less checks and balances. Once again, the fact they were all fallible men is important because that means that they would all have differing opinions for how the country should be run. While some would be happy with how their democratic republic had turned out, others would probably be severely unhappy with the results. However, more important than their reactions to how America's history has played out or how their government turned out is the public opinion of the Constitution, which ties really back into the story I told you at the beginning. What would the Founding Fathers think of, well, what we think of the Constitution today? Would they be shocked to hear a kid reference it as the Constitution of Independence? Would they be offended by children asking their parents to explain the differences between our two most important documents in history? I think so. I think that they might be divided on their political views and their social views and possibly even their moral views, but they would be united in the idea that ignorance of the Constitution is inexcusable. For above all other reasons, they saw the value in an educated people. They themselves were educated. It was their education that allowed them to create this totally different type of government in the first place. It was their culture's educated state that allowed this government to get going, no matter how faulty or long of a start it may have been. The education of the nation allowed it to thrive and become a superpower. And the lack of education in the nation caused it to spiral downward in a pool of political apathy, historical ignorance, and general confusion. They would be disappointed with the so-called history teachers who teach politically correct history instead of historically correct history. They would be disappointed with the politicians who have the audacity to stand in front of a town hall meeting and say, sure, I agree, the Constitution is very important, but there's this other thing. Perhaps Ben Franklin would be only more certain that we are on the road to despotism today. Now, I've asked multiple times during this speech what the Founding Fathers would think today, but the question should always have a reason for being asked. I mean, why do we care what they think today? They're dead. After all, they weren't demigods. Why should we care what a wannabe swim coach or a toothless old war hero think? The answer to that lies in the question. They weren't demigods. They weren't infallible. That's exactly it. They were normal people. And at the heart of every decision that they made was an educated, patriotic yearning to make a difference, and a difference for the better. And that thought, that underlying desire behind all of their bickering and arguing and compromising in that hot steakhouse in that summer in Philadelphia, that was what made them great. And that thought would stay with them no matter what century they had found themselves in. That thought is what they would want to impart on us, to the confused high school senior on the phone, to the old granny with their grandson, to every child and adult in this nation. That with education and a passion to do good, and a longing for the preservation of liberty, you can make a difference. Just like the Founding Fathers on September 17th, 1787. Thank you.
And we have this beautiful certificate. And for our college winners, we have $2,000.